First of all, we'd like to welcome everybody and thank everyone for coming. My name is Chinyere Okoro. I'm a current 3L at St. Mary's, rising 3L at St. Mary's University School of Law, and I'm currently president of the Black Law Students Association. And my co-host, Candace Castillo.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Candace Castillo, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Scholar Law Review, St. Mary's Law Review on Race and Social Justice. Thank you for being here again.
And I'd also like to, we also have here Tanya Burke, who will be our secretary for the evening, taking notes. And this will be recorded for anybody who wants to watch later, or for anybody that you know who wasn't able to tune in with us today right now. So starting first, I'd like to introduce one of our panelists, our Dean Haynes. Some of us may be familiar with Dean Haynes from the law school. He is a former assistant district attorney and is currently, Dean of Student Affairs at St. Mary's University School of Law. He previously worked at University of Minnesota School of Law and as the director of the Career Center and as chair of the law school's diversity committee. And he's here with us this evening to speak on those prior experiences, as well as from the perspective of a Black lawyer in general.
Also joining us is Chas Moore. He's the founder of Austin Justice Coalition, a nonprofit and grassroots activist-led organization aimed at demanding criminal justice reform and building community at the local, state, and national levels. He has many activist passions that include criminal justice reform, as well as creating spaces for Black leaders and leaders of color, implementing progressive and best practices policies in local entities, and organizing and challenging community members to get civically engaged. Before devoting full-time work to the creation and growth of Austin Justice Coalition, Chas served as a student activist fighting many social issues at the University of Texas at Austin and in the Austin community. He's won many awards, such as the Champions of Change Nonprofit Leader of the Year Award in 2019, as well as 2018's Best of Austin Best Activist Award. Thanks for being here, Chas.
Next on our panel, we have Sharon Breckenridge Thomas, who is a St. Mary's University grad from the undergraduate and from the School of Law. She was a JAG attorney for 15 years in the Air Force, and as well as, a member of the St. Mary's University School of Law Board of Trustees. She was recently appointed by Governor Greg Abbott to the Texas Commission on Law Enforcement. And the commission ensures that Texans are served by highly trained and ethical law enforcement and corrections personnel through screening, developing, and monitoring resources. And she's here with us this evening to review those procedures with us as well.
We are also very glad to welcome Daryl Harris here with us. He's the Deputy Chief of Criminal Trial at the Bexar County District Attorney's Office. He's been at the District Attorney's Office in Bexar County here since 2002. He's a graduate of St. Mary's School of Law, and he's a member of the San Antonio Black Lawyers Association and an active member of Grace First Baptist Church. He has lots of many awards under his belt, and he's also an author. He has authored and published in the San Antonio Lawyer and with the Scholar. He has written By Any Means Necessary, Evaluating the Effectiveness of Texas's DNA Testing Law and the Adjudication of Freestanding Claims of Actual Innocence, published in 2003. He is a retired Army officer and has served in a variety of command and staff positions worldwide for 20 years of service. He has a Master's of Science degree in Operations Research and Systems Analysis from Kansas State University, and he holds a Bachelor of Science in Economics from the United States Military Academy at West Point. Thank you for being with us, Daryl. So now what we're going to do is we're going to get started with opening statements from our panelists. Each of our panelists will have up to 5 minutes to give an opening statement to start off our conversation. So going first will be Dean Haynes.
Thank you. A couple of weeks ago, we learned about what had happened to Ahmaud Arbery. Of course, even though his death took place in February, the circumstances of his death were not known until much later. That seems like a lifetime ago. After his death, of course, George Floyd became a household name because a police officer in Minneapolis placed his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck for over 8 minutes. And as he begged for his life, and as he cried for his mother, we all got to see that. And those images were shocking, they were appalling, they were horrifying. And then this past weekend, Rashard Brooks was shot as he fled from a scene, even though police officers had his identification, had his car, and knew where he lived. But there are more cases, many, many more. Botham Jean was eating ice cream in his apartment in Dallas when he was shot and killed by a police officer. Ariana Jefferson was killed by a police officer in Fort Worth as she played video games with her nephew. John Crawford was shot and killed in Beaver Creek, Ohio, because he carried a toy gun in a Walmart. Jordan Crawford, 15-year-old Jordan Crawford, was killed here in Texas because he left a party where teenagers were consuming alcohol and he didn't want to get in trouble. One that's very personal to me involved a young man named Kenneth Banks back when I was assistant DA in New York in 1998. Back then, police officers had huge radios, 2-pound radios. And Officer Craig Yokomick took his 2-pound radio and he threw it and he hit Kenneth Banks in the head with it while he was riding a bicycle. Kenneth fell off the bike and hit his head on the pavement, was in a coma for 2 weeks before he died. We have something in New York called the Early Assessment Bureau, where you intake cases. And so I talked with Officer Yokomick. And Officer Yokomick told me that Kenneth Banks had resisted arrest and he had fell off his bike resisting arrest, and that he had obstructed governmental administration. Kenneth Banks' family sued and received a reward of about $1 million from New York City. Even after those events where there were witnesses who said that Kenneth Banks had been hit with the police radio, the case did go to the grand jury, but it was a no bill. Craig Yokomick kept his job. It was about 2003 before he was indicted and charged with violation of Kenneth Banks' civil rights, and it ended up in prison. I mention that for a very important reason, and that is because we have to begin to look at these incidents and all the others and wonder whether or not these things are isolated incidents or whether they are a pattern and a practice that is part of the culture of policing. I believe that it is. So I'd like to look at a couple of things today if we get a chance to. I'd like to look at some actual numbers, and some of the numbers come out. Pew Research Center says, in 2017, said about 27% of police officers use their weapons. So that's over a quarter of policemen. And we find out that of those who use their weapons, they're more likely to approve of harsh physical methods in dealing with people. And so when we have a lot of officers out there who don't fall in that fact pattern, we have over a quarter that do. And a quarter, would be my argument, would do things like place a knee on a man's neck for 8 minutes. So there are a lot of things to cover. Our past, our original sins in the Constitution, whether it's the 3/5 clause or whether it's importation of slaves after 1808. But one thing is clear, that unless we have a true discussion about where we are and put everything on the table and look at police officers, look at how we've created a school to prison pipeline, and look at ways to reform police departments across the country, these things will continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Haynes. Chas Moore, will you go next?
Thank you. I was afraid you were going to ask me to go after that. Yeah, you know, I think the dean hit it right on the head, and I won't try to take up the whole 5 minutes. I have a few different trains of thought, but they all kind of tie into exactly what he said. As somebody that's been doing activism now for my whole adult life, really, I started doing activism or being awakened ever since I got to the University of Texas at Austin, which is, for the people that don't know, a very white place, which was new to me coming from Houston, Texas, where I grew up around, you know, Black and Latino people. And, you know, I joke, and, you know, we have to be able to joke during these conversations, so just bear with me. You know, and I used to joke that I only saw white people in Houston when I went to Target. So, you know, it was a culture shock for me to come to Austin and be literally one Black face in a class of 300 white people. So I learned then that we had not come to like this utopia and, you know, this place of race being over. But I say all that to say, I've been a part of many marches and movements and, you know, all these things throughout these years, but now feels like a very genuine time in this country where I think it seems like we're ready to deal with these original sins, right? And, you know, the two original sins that I think this country has to deal with if we ever really want to heal is first the genocide of Native Americans and then the enslavement of Black people. And I think now this country is realizing that, and it's really up to us and mainly white America and people that hold power and privilege in this country, if they want to really deal with that, because we have to understand that you can't talk equality, you can't talk equity if you're still holding on to something that makes you better than inherently, right? You have to let that go. So I think we seem to be at that moment, but, you know, this could also be another, you know, Boston Marathon moment where, you know, we kumbaya for 6 weeks, or a 9/11 moment where we kumbaya for a year and we all sung that song, Proud to be an American, in middle school and high school. We sung it every day for 6 months. And then after 6 months, we went back to who we are as a country and as a nation. And then when it comes to policing, something that I've been, you know, saying for years, really under my breath, because I didn't think we would ever get to this moment in my lifetime. But 2020 has been a year, right? Like, I cannot wait to see all the books that are coming about this year alone. But I think we have to get to a place where, one, we reckon with the inception of policing, which is to catch and police Black bodies as they were running away for their freedom. That is the very beginning of what we know as policing. And then you also have to pay a very close part to a conversation that never happened, right? We come up with the 13th Amendment, which gets rid of, abolishes slavery in a way, right? Which is up for argument. But we never once at that moment had a conversation around what we do with the institution of policing then. So if we get rid of the thing that the institution was created for, but we don't update what the institution does now, since we got rid of the purpose of it, it only makes sense that it transform. And that's why we see the legal lynching of Black and brown bodies. That's why we see, like the dean said, the knee on the neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Like, so now I think we're at a critical place in this country where we have to critically and deeply rethink it. One, if we even need this thing in today's society, and if we do need it, it has to be drastically different. Why is it that we have cops going to 911 mental health calls, right? Because in the argument that some people say is that, well, you know, cops in Austin are trained for that. No, they're not. Like in comparison, they do 40 hours max. They do 40 hours in mental health training compared to the hundreds, 200s of hours they do in response to resistance. If somebody gets into a car wreck, do we really need an armed officer to go to that scene, right? It's just like, I think we have to reimagine the role of policing, and we have to really start thinking about divesting from the police department and investing in communities, and really just reallocating the responsibilities of police department to make sure that everybody can actually feel safe. And the last thing I'll say for right now is, I think a conversation that needs to be had around the conversation around policing has to be the concept of safety, right? Safety in American context is a very white privileged term. That's why, you know, Amy Cooper in Central Park felt that she could call 911, right? Because 911 is a that does protect and serve them. And safety in American context largely only entails that of white America, right? That's why Trayvon thought he was safe walking in his neighborhood, going to his house, but he wasn't. And that's why George Zimmerman felt unsafe, right? So I think we have to unpack all of this stuff. We have to unpack all of this privilege and racism that comes with who we are as a country if we want to heal together. So I hope that made sense. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
It does, thank you. And Sharon Thomas, will you go next?
Well, good evening, everyone. I am so happy and humbled to be here and to be a part of this conversation. I come from a family of police officers. My father and uncles and cousins have all been a part of the policing dynamic. And so I may bring a different viewpoint based upon that personal experience. But I, like you, when I saw that video of the police officer's knee on the neck of George Floyd, I, like you, and I think this entire nation just gasped to see it. We've all heard about the bad cops, but to actually see it in action and to actually see what I would call the audacious evil that was portrayed in that video caused great pause for me. And I think it has caused great pause for our nation and has required us to begin to talk about issues that would get us to this place in America in 2020. My heart is breaking for our nation and for our country. And the question becomes, can we get this thing right? And some of us, as I look at the developments over the few weeks, some of us are at a point where we just don't trust anymore, and perhaps rightfully so. I don't believe that and we're going to talk about resolutions, but I don't believe that the resolution is to just get rid of and dismantle everything. I do believe, however, that we really need to have some conversations and to garner an understanding of what policing is today and how we might make it a better system in place. As you know, I serve on the Texas Commission on Law Enforcement, and we hear cases of individuals, I'm just going to say bad cops, that have done some things that would require the revoking of their license. That is a needed work, but I believe that we need to have in place some other institutional safeguards that will ensure that we are going to be able to assess and deal with these bad cops, because the good cops want to get rid of the bad cops as well. And unfortunately, the way the system now operates, it makes it extremely difficult. So I'm looking forward to having the conversation and to talk about things such as reform and what that might look like. For example, the collective bargaining agreements that are involved in policing just in the state of Texas can be different from each agency. The San Antonio Police Department may have a different collective bargaining agreement than the Austin Police Department. And because of that lack of uniformity, it allows for cracks to exist in the system, because bad cops can take their cases to arbitration and never have those cases heard before the Texas Commission on Law Enforcement, and an arbitrator can send them back. Police chiefs are at their wits' end because they know they're having to take back bad cops. And I believe that part of the solution, if you will, is we've got to look at our state and federal lawmakers and demand that they assist us as the community in remedying some of this situation. I hope to have an opportunity to talk about training and what training looks like in Texas for police officers, and to also have a dialogue as to how that training may be better for communities. I'd also like to delve into the issue of what I would call a twofold de-escalation training process, where both police officers and community members can participate in programs together to learn how to de-escalate situations so that they don't arise to what we've just seen with regard to Rayshard Brooks. And finally, I hope that we get to talk about the need to look at infrastructures that are in place, but then to also give authority to the infrastructure so that there is accountability in the system. I think if we become so distrustful of law enforcement that we do away with it, eventually that is going to be to our harm. And so my hope and my prayer is that as a nation, we will get to resolution that is different, so that my grandchildren will not be facing this issue in the next 20 years. And I believe we're at a place to really make some things happen. So thank you so much for inviting me as a part of this conversation.
Thank you. And Mr. Harris?
First off, good evening to all. Particularly heartened to see it's the scholar that is sponsoring this. Then I guess being of a different generation, I have to play off Mr. Haynes's remarks, Mr. Moore's, my friend, Ms. Thomas. I entered active duty in 1981 and served on active duty through 2001. And I have to notch certain things that influence that I bring into my office today through that career. Some of you may have read the time frame when the Berlin Wall fell. And at that time, the military, our country was downsizing. The Soviet Union fell, the Berlin Wall fell. We decided we're gonna get a peace dividend and cut our military by about a third. I can recall being redeployed from Germany, sitting in a gym at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, because they were cutting part of the officer corps. And hearing an individual, he just say his name was Joe Blow. I'm Joe Blow, and I represent the United States Federal Bureau of Prisons. We want to say that we project the prisons being a growth industry through the first half of the next century. I heard that in the spring of 1991. Subsequent on my checklist, I was on active duty in March of 91. Saw 5 LAPD officers beat an individual by the name of Rodney King. That touched all of us. I also was flabbergasted like everyone else when I saw in April of the next year, 92, 4 of those officers were found not guilty by a jury. Anecdotally, many will say that those were some of the frustrations that fueled the aftermath riots, and those same sentiments bled forward to this next kind of keystone event, the O.J. Simpson verdict. When that verdict came out, my family, we were serving in Korea. I had to go to a meeting. I was riding a bike to get to a meeting. I remember I was on an installation. I remember riding by a newsstand. There was the international edition of USA Today and the Pacific edition of Stars and Stripes. And out the corner of my eye, I could see the verdict, the results of it on the papers. One said Simpson walks. The other said Simpson acquitted. Stopped me in my tracks. I had to ride halfway back up the hill because I didn't believe it. All of these things are the context as I looked at it, being African American, having raised 2 sons through this. Part of it influenced my thinking as I entered St. Mary's after retirement in 2001. I also had an opportunity to meet Johnny Cochran himself in 2003. He came to San Antonio. He was part of a housing effort on the east side and went there, had the opportunity to get in line to talk to the man as an aspiring law student, an officer in Balsa at the time. And I knew because of my background that, yes, I was likely going to head into the prosecution because I wanted into the courtroom. And his words were, do it. We need perspectives. We need different viewpoints at all ends of the system. And so with all of that as background, I have followed and watched and read every one of these instances across the nation, looking for parallels, similarities, having a bit of informed mind, much like Dean Haynes, of what happens inside a grand jury and how things present and come out. And the 3 things I take from all of that: perspectives and inclusion, the disparity in viewpoints from the same incident, the same stimulus, and because we have to be, there is no alternative, hope still. It has to spring eternal. And with those, I look forward to joining my thoughts with those of the panel and of the audience, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. So we're going to get started with some pre-submitted questions. As we go throughout this webinar, attendees, please feel free to enter a question you may have for a panelist in the chat, in the question and answer feature, not the chat feature. And so we're going to get started with some questions for you, Mr. Harris, and I believe she has the first one.
So Mr. Harris, there are 3 questions for you that have been submitted. I'll go with the first one. The first one is, and I'll also type it for you so that you can see. Has the DA's office looked into ways of better handling instances where an officer doesn't turn on his body cam when making contact with and arresting an individual? And if so, would the individual arrested still face charges, and would the officer face any consequences?
Thank you for the question. First, clarity and distinction. Policies as to when an officer uses or has the body cam on, those are internal to the respective organizations. Not having it on may not necessarily be an intentional act. It's actually, I have seen footage of an officer having it on, going to talk to a witness, and he detours into the men's room. Thank God it was muted, and I'm glad he didn't look down. So the mere fact that it's not on is not necessarily nefarious. But it's also not a crime. That's a policy provision of the agency. So that's kind of outside our purview. If it appears to have been silenced during critical stages, you can believe that that would be fair game for questioning on an investigation. Hope that answers, whoever asked it, hope that answers.
The next question, there are 3. So the next question is, has the DA's office considered creating a department within the DA's office with the duty of investigating acts of alleged police misconduct to replace the current internal investigation performed by the police department when allegations of police misconduct arise?
Thank you much. Again, towards clarification, this district attorney's office is not an investigative body. There are approximately 30 separate law enforcement agencies throughout Bexar County. All of them file cases into our office. So we have to maintain a semblance of independence across them all. We then take the results of those investigations, we present and we articulate and advocate for the state. We have a portion of our office that is somewhat segregated from the balance of the office that does specifically take those investigations and present those to the grand jury that is charged with it. We are currently discussing if there are better ways for us to do this. Can we play a role in bringing independent outside agencies into internal investigations within Bexar County? So we are discussing it, but as currently structured, we get the results of the investigation. We don't conduct them ourselves.
And the last part of this question is, has the DA's office considered more effective ways in which officers found of police misconduct can be held accountable for their misconduct? I think that kind of ties into your last answer as well.
Yeah, and thank you for, and Will, it was as a follow-up. Now, currently we maintain a list of officers that have been found lacking in some standard, which again is generated from internal department policies and or that may have been charged, etc. Because we are the gatekeeper as for what is presented in courts, we keep a disclosure list shared with counsel and those accused as needed. The disclosure list for any incidents is one thing. There's also a separate list of those smaller that are permanently that my office will not sponsor as witnesses for one reason or another. Generally, those things that impinge on integrity, since we have to sponsor you as a witness and our legal obligation is to pursue justice. The discipline of those folks, again, those are internal to the specific agency that's hired them. Our purview is only if someone is accused, which would be by their agency or an independent agency, charged and prosecuted, Then we handle the criminal prosecution as if they were any other defendant, subject to the Texas Penal Code, Code of Criminal Procedure, etc. I hope I've explained it.
Thank you. And then our next pre-submitted question, Candace, if you'd like to go ahead and read that one to our panelists.
It looked like Sharon had something she wanted to add on to that conversation.
Okay, I see her hand.
Yeah, thank you, Daryl, for giving us that insight, and that leads to what I've been seeing with regard to there needing to be some uniformity with regard to how all of the cases of discipline are handled in the state of Texas. And this is not true across the nation, but in the state of Texas, we have the infrastructure to allow for the type of investigations that I think this audience member is leaning towards. Are we going to have accountability in the system? In Texas, we have the infrastructure. What we lack in Texas is the authority to, and the funding to allow the Texas Commission on Law Enforcement to go out and to conduct those investigations so as to come to a determination so that you've got accountability that is in the system. We have the infrastructure. We have investigators. We don't have investigators. I won't say we don't have investigators. I will say that our investigators are prohibited under Texas Occupation Code 1701.457 from conducting those types of investigations. And so, again, the infrastructure is there that I think would lead to a uniform treatment of dealing with disciplinary matters so that we can adequately deal with issues that where individuals need to be processed in and perhaps processed out of their policing duties and requirements. Yes, sir. Dean Haynes, do you have a question for me?
Well, yeah, I just want to add one piece. I understand what Ms. Thomas is saying about that. I used to be a union lawyer as well for the teachers union, and their individual, and that I believe we were talking about earlier, their individual union contracts. And so there's a whole disciplinary structure that's there, that's left. One of the things that I do think that we need to reimagine is how union contracts are actually negotiated, and whether there needs to be rethinking on how that works, especially when it comes to discipline. There are a number of things that cannot be done unless you go through certain procedures. And a smart cop who's done something bad is going to use the union to the full extent, and unions are going to do that. As I work for a union, I call both unions and corporations necessary evils. So probably tells you a little bit about my politics, but I do think that we do have to be cognizant that before we can have some of these police reforms, we're going to have the input of police unions to rethink how they put together those disciplinary structures and make it possible for those cops who are problematic to have an expedited process, maybe perhaps to remove them. So I think that's something to really think about as well.
I agree totally. And also to the point where we should take a look at the Federal Arbitration Act itself. It's an act that's been in place for many years now, and it may very well need to be looked at. I would encourage our federal lawmakers to take a look at the Federal Arbitration Act to see if unintentionally it is now being utilized to tie the hands of police chiefs and individuals within the policing community that really would like to address these issues. As you know, Dean Haynes, an arbitrator's decision is very hard to overturn.
Yep.
It just
Yep.
is.
Yes.
And so I think part of the reform would be to ask our federal legislatures to take a look at the Federal Arbitration Act and to carve out perhaps some exceptions as it deals with policing itself. So since we're talking about imagined changes, I think everything is on the table with regard to what it is that we can do to bring about these reforms.
Great. And speaking of, okay, Mr. Harris?
And I don't want to belabor this point if there's another question, but in this area, I'm a total novice. I'll defer to Dean Haynes and Ms. Thomas. But it's always struck me as funny because Texas itself is a right to work state. And ultimately, these issues are local government, local policing issues. How does the public service sector unions, the fire, police, et cetera, how do they position themselves in states that by their overall political structure are right to work? I'm just curious as to how that was carved out for these specific type of entities historically.
I mean, well,
I will say,
oh yeah, go ahead. I mean, you know more than me. You sit on TCO, but I think the answer to that question is chapter 143, civil service, right? It's a lot of added bonuses that police and fire and EMS get through unionizing because of chapter 143 that I think Ms. Thomas is going to talk about a little bit, but we're talking about changes and repeals that need to happen. I think some major stuff needs to happen within chapter 143, but I just wanted to add that in there.
And while we're on the subject of changes that need to be made, one of the major subjects that we wanted to broach in this discussion was qualifications for police officers. So there's a viral protester holding up her sign that reads, "We live in a world where trained cops can panic and act on impulse, but untrained civilians must remain calm with a gun in their face." And this really visceral image brings up a lot of questions. Nationally, folks are sharing a lot of statistics right now that show we're not taking the time to train law enforcement enough and on the right subjects. In many police departments, it takes more training to become a beautician or a barber than it takes to become a police officer. Police departments are able to take more than the mandated amount of training, but it is optional. So I want to open up a question to everyone. What qualifications will help law enforcement officers be better decision makers in a crisis and more compassionate to the needs of the community?
Dean
Haynes?
Well, I was actually looking at this. I looked on the website to find out what it was. And in San Antonio, the standards are a GED, high school diploma, 2.0 GPA, and then 6 months training, police academy training. Frankly, I just don't think that's enough. And so my sense is that that we probably need to have people with bachelor's degrees at a minimum. I know for a lot of people that's controversial. I did want to point out that there was a study done by Florida Officers, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, wrote that officers with only high school educations were the subject of 75% of all disciplinary actions. Officers with 4-year degrees accounted for only 11% of such actions. So that one of the things we find that if you do have someone with a BA, you're going to get someone who's more rounded, someone who has better at making decisions, someone who is going to be able to listen a little bit better and so forth. So I do think, from my perspective at least, that we have to remember that what we're doing with police officers, we're in some cases putting people out there with as little as 6 months training, and we're giving them the ability to use deadly force. And that makes, I think there has to be a real, I think we really do need to take a look at whether it requires more. And I think the data show that that moving in the direction of having police officers with a bachelor's degree would be helpful.
I think, well, not I think, I know it's data that proves that, but I also think we have to look at internationally, countries don't have the same issues around policing as this country does, right? You have some places in the world, I believe Switzerland, they train for 2 years before they're out in the street dealing with people. And that results in people not dying and people not being beat and harassed and all these type of things. So I do think longer training is a part of the conversation, but then I also think we have to look at places like Eugene, Oregon with the Cahoots program, where they were having robust problems with officers showing up to 911 mental health calls. And they had the bright idea, these officers are not trained adequately enough to deal with this. Let's actually put social workers and people that deal with people in this situation. And, la-di-da, no one has died. Like either the person that's going through the distress or the person that shows up to the call. And what they're doing in San Francisco now, they're still fleshing it out, but they came to the decision that, you know what, we're not going to send officers to non-criminal calls, right? I think if we insist that we need this role with police, which I'm down for whatever the people want to do, I think we have to be willing to relinquish a lot of the duties that is bestowed upon them these days, right? Again, I think they are overworked, and we know they're overworked. When you look at some of the issues that officers go through, right? We know that they, a lot of them develop substance abuse. A lot of them are really volatile partners because of the stress of the job. I mean, the job is hella stressful, and I understand that. So now we're asking them to be a social worker, to be an after school, mom or dad or whatever. Like, we need to take some of that responsibility away from them, say they can do the serious stuff, right? When Austin had the bomber, the Austin bomber, that to me is the type of stuff police should be doing. Or, I think most of us have seen SVU in some capacity. Nobody's ever upset at, the SVU cops. Like, that's the type of police work that most of us expect police to do. Property crimes and things of that nature. We also know cops don't do well with that, but you know who does? Forensics. And right, another best practice that's been talked about around the world, forensics should not be part of police departments. So again, I think we have to start relinquishing some of the duties that we assume go to police officers so they can do their job better. And that window for their job should be very small, in my opinion.
But if I could, and I don't, maybe I'm contrarian to my stated position on this panel, the things that we have that leave us with the questions and the frustrations, I don't know that you can train out of. Most recently, if you look at Atlanta, the shooting in Atlanta. Now, this started off affable, etc. Mm-hmm. There's a physical struggle, but there was also time and separation between when the shots were fired. For those of you who have either interned or done criminal, you know that we look for, was there an opportunity to cool off before resuming the force? Right. Minnesota, there was no contention whatsoever. And there was just something broke to, like, dude, do you not see you've got him? Most of these, there's currently jurisprudence going on right now. Fourth Circuit is started to attack the qualified immunity doctrine. And the facts on that case, a lone person, homeless, is surrounded by 4 or 5 officers. Mm-hmm. Somebody realizes he's got a pocket knife in his sleeve, and 23 shots are fired. So again, this is, there is no intense, immediate, ongoing, split-second decision. There is an opportunity for reflection. There's an opportunity, let's put our heads together. You watch this guy, the 4 of us talk. So I don't know how you train that. That is a paradigm that has to be broken. I'm all for training, but the ones that I think leave us most frustrated, how do you train when I'm going into somebody else's house and they react the way I would if somebody comes into my house? I don't know how you train to that. Some things I just think are more basic.
Yeah.
And I want to add one thing to that, Ms. Thomas, then I'm gonna shut up. I promise I'll shut up. Like I agree with that, Mr. Harris, because one thing that's come up a lot recently is people asking for an increase or implementation of duty to intervene training. And I don't know how hard is it to tell somebody in the case of George Floyd. I think that's just common humanity, that somebody would come in and say, hey man, I think that's enough. Like how do you really train that? And I think you said it perfectly. There's a paradigm and a culture shift that needs to happen. And you can't train your way out of that, right? Like that takes some hard work, I guess, because like in that moment, the thing that was most sickening to me was the fact that 4 other officers watched George Floyd suffer and die. And like, it doesn't, I just can't imagine what that training would look like. Like you tapping somebody on the shoulder and saying, calm down. That shouldn't take 20 to 40 hours of training to me. I'm sorry, Ms. Thomas.
No, that's okay. If I could interject here, and this may sound philosophical, but this is a recruitment issue as well. As Dean Haynes mentioned about the requirements, it's a recruitment issue. And we have to work towards recruiting. To be a police, you've got to have a heart, because your major role is to protect the community.
Yes.
And there are mechanisms in place from an employment perspective. There are testing mechanisms that may not be 100%, but they will indicate whether or not this particular recruit is good for the position that he is applying for. It really is and you're right, it's going to take a paradigm shift, because policing in the past, it used to be that training was an us against them kind of situation or dynamic. And it wasn't until recent years that training began to take a change to indicate or to emphasize that this is not an us against them. This is, we have been called to be protectors of this community or protectors of society. And in order to protect, we must have an underlying regard and respect for humanity, no matter what class level they might be, or no matter what color they might be. We are training individuals that necessarily have to come with what I'm going to call is this heart element. And it can be done. And hopefully from dialogues like this and from dialogues that are taking place around the nation, we will come to some uniformity in our expectations of who it is that we're even going to hire, recruit as police officers. You just can't pull somebody off the street and assume that they have the necessary requirements for policing in this age. Yeah, Dean Haynes.
Dean Haynes, and then we'll get started on some questions from the audience.
Okay, great. Yeah, I just wanted to mention a couple of things. You know, I've worn many hats. You know, I never decided what I was going to do when I grew up. I used to be a teacher as well, and before I started my teaching, before I started my training as a student teacher, we went through this whole battery of tests where they had us sit down and I don't know if they do this at police academies or they do this with folks, but they got an analysis of how my mind worked and how I did things and how I might approach things. And I think that having that factor in at the recruiting end is something that's important. But I do think one of the other things that we need to talk about and that is mental health counseling. Frankly, I think it should be mandated for police officers from this perspective. First of all, I don't think that mental health counseling is something that's bad or taboo. I think that's a problem, frankly, in the legal profession. People think that it's taboo when it's not. But having a counselor, going to someone, these guys and women, they deal with a lot of issues that create what we call secondary trauma. and you see things. You see a lot of things. You see people being beaten up. You see people who are abused. You see all kinds of stuff, and that has an incredible impact on a person's psyche. And the fact that we are not sitting people down and saying, hey, it's okay to get counseling for that, or even saying that that's part of your contract, that you have to get counseling. I think those sorts of things are the reimagining that I think we need to take a look at. Because if we have people who automatically suppose that because a person looks this way or because they're from that neighborhood, well, then that means that they're bad, and we have to control them, that's a bad outcome for everybody. And I think there's too many police departments where that can become a problem.
If I could mention for the state of Texas, just in case the audience wants to know, the basic requirements for a peace officer is that they have to have a medical evaluation, they have to have a psychological evaluation, there's a criminal history check, a 30-plus page personal history statement that must be submitted, there is a background investigation, and then there is the academy, which is 696 hours. One of the things that I participated in as a commissioner was this training, this de-escalation training, a 4-day training segment that was offered by an organization. It's a private organization that's called Walk a Mile in My Shoes. And this organization has trained over 2,000 individuals in the San Antonio area, and actually began in the Baltimore area. But anyway, what I found most significant about this training was it brought police officers from the San Antonio community along with community members, and this was on the east side of San Antonio, together to go through this 4-day, and it was de-escalation training. And there was actual role plays where we were given certain hypotheticals where we were police officers, and then we were taught what de-escalation was and what it looks like, and then we were actually put into a role play so that we could get an understanding as community members what police officers experience. On the other side of the coin, police officers played the role of community members in terms of what the community is feeling and what they experience in dealing with police officers who are not respectable, who don't perhaps have an ounce of ethics, and quite frankly, probably shouldn't even have a license or a badge. It was a great experience because it allowed both the community and the police department to come together to understand the different things. And the police officers were able to say to the community, now, if you go and grab for our gun, it's probably not going to be a really good outcome, simply because of the way we've been trained. I'm not saying that the training is correct, but at least there was this dialogue on, here's the way you can de-escalate as a community member, and here's the way we can de-escalate as police officers. It was a great training. I highly recommend it. Google it, Walk a Mile in My Shoes. And they do training throughout San Antonio and Texas. Yeah.
So we need to get started on some questions from the audience. One question is to any panelist: how do you feel about police officers receiving continuing education similar to a CLE for attorneys, at least biannually, to keep them up to date on current new laws, and also more mandatory training throughout a calendar year?
If I could, they get ongoing continual training. It's I need somebody to testify. You found the key evidence. We're going to trial. I've used up my settings. I'm in service that week. Dude, I need you here. I think it goes back to the actual question of what is the orientation and training that then makes you a more participatory part of the community that you're in. So they're qualified to shoot. They qualify in open hand techniques. How do you interact so that both sides walk away from the encounter? Now, I don't know what class that is.
And how often are they getting this continuing training?
I do know that, I'm not sure how much it is. Sharon might be better able to answer that, but I do know that there's generally, they have to do X number of hours. It's probably per state. Different states
Yes.
have different reasons. I do know, for example, that the fellow who shot, who was involved in the shooting of Arbery, was a former cop, and the reason that he lost his job was because he wasn't keeping up with his credits.
So I don't have the exact number, but I can tell you that CE, or continuing education, is mandatory, and that if a peace officer does not keep up with this CE, with his or her CE, their license can be revoked.
Okay.
Thank you. So the next kind of direction that we're going to go in is with one of our pre-submitted questions. And it asks, well, it starts with more of a statement. I can't help but be overwhelmed with emotion when I feel our country has done a complete 180 in the past few weeks. During COVID-19, there was a sense of unity in each community across the nation. Now we're once again divided. I feel some people have made up their mind and have little to no desire to educate themselves on a systematic issue in our country. Is there a way to reach out, educate, or talk to those who do not see a problem? If we cannot educate others, what do we do about the opposing view? Will this ever be realistic? If we cannot persuade others to understand that there's a major issue, the issue itself may never be resolved. The issue might be resolved if there is once again unity between every American. So I think the question that's being asked here is, what are some ways that we can reach out and educate those who don't see a problem here, and help others educate themselves on what the systematic issue is that we're talking about?
Just my initial 2 cents. I'll check Dr. King's writings during the civil rights movement, because the often time referral was that you can't legislate the heart. And his response, no, maybe I can't, but you know what? I can make illegal what they're doing to hurt me. Okay, so that's number one. But then the second, we've got long-standing, long-term battles. I remember reading something that in the abortion battle, if both sides could see the other as potential converts to win and persuade, as opposed to the other that you have to destroy and conquer, because if you see it that's the latter, you ain't never gonna agree. It's just gonna be whoever survives. So towards the despair, don't give into it, and just keep trying every doggone day, and approach from as much of a human side as you can. I don't know any other way.
I think that at the core of this issue is we really have not settled and rehabilitated some of the ills from slavery. And so it is like, when we have what we have going on in our country right now, it's like pulling a Band-Aid off of a festering sore that never healed. And we have to really be intentional about, number one, insisting on being healed, and number two, to be willing to walk with one another as human beings, so to speak, so that that wholeness and that healing will take place. And I think that one of the things that will causes individuals to kind of enter into their own camps is, you look at empirical data, right? And so you hear the arguments about, oh, okay, well, if you compare police officer involved Black shootings on individuals or citizens that are African American to Black on Black crime, the numbers are just astronomically different, and no one's protesting because of this Black on Black crime. And I think that answer misses the point. And it misses the point that we're dealing with humanity here. We're dealing with a life here. We're dealing with a mother's child here. We don't want to hear anything about numbers and empirical data. We want to get to the heart of the issue so that we are dealing with one another as human beings. And it's that age-old question with Cain and Abel. When Cain murdered Abel, he said, "Am I my brother's keeper?" And the question is yes, we are. We are our brothers and our sisters' keeper. And we will live in a nation where the hashtag must change from hashtag I can't breathe to hashtag I will breathe. Yeah.
You know, I think that, you know, one of the things, you know, Sharon mentioned was the issue of people talking about black on black crime. And every time I hear that, I think that people don't talk about white on white crime because, you know, people tend to kill people in their own race because they tend to kill people who they know. So if you look at murder rates and you look at it, there's a lot of intra-racial killings. And so you know, I think that's important. You know, but I do think we need to look at attitudes. I do think we need to look at the past. We need to look at explicit bias and implicit bias and how things can go terribly, terribly wrong. You know, I thought about mentioning this, and I do think I have an obligation to mention it. I talked a little bit about it to some of the panelists beforehand, or some of the folks beforehand. You know, back in, it was about the same time period, about 1998 or so, when I was at the DA's office in Manhattan. I had just gotten off of work. I remember it was a Sunday. I remember it was Sunday because it was slow in New York, and I was at 23rd and Broadway because I was taking the bus back to work. I mean, back home after work. And I worked early assessment bureau on Sundays because we went 7 days a week. So you knew you had to go. And so I got off from work. I went into a Subway sandwich shop. And as I was walking in, this tall white man with green pants and this frizzled reddish brown hair walked out, and he looked sort of strange to me. And so I walked in, and the woman behind the counter, she said, "That man just tried to get behind the counter." I said, "Oh, wow. Well, that's bad. Well, I'll stay with you." And she said, "I call the cops." So I'll stay with you until the cops come. And so I started to order a sandwich and stayed with her. And I still remember the scaffolding. I remember the scaffolding more than anything else. Scaffolding was in front of the building, 23rd and Broadway. And two cops come into view, and they're both rushing in. And one of them saw me and pulled his gun out right at me. And the worker, the woman said, "That's not him." And you can think about how many different ways that a gun sideways. And I can tell you, I mean, it's still an experience where you look at it and you still see this cop, you know, slow motion, putting a gun right up at you, right up at your torso. And I can say this, is his partner looked at him like, "Are you crazy?" But that comes down to training and understanding that in a situation like that, when a guy's ordering a sandwich, the condiments on his Subway sandwich, it's probably not a dangerous situation. And that has to do with body language. That has to do with the way that you look at two people interacting with each other. And those are the sort of things I think that we need to deal with and talk about, because I guarantee you, I am not the only person who is African-American and who is male, who's had a gun pointed at him by a cop, who has been pulled over for failure to signal. And those are real things. And I do think we have to make sure that we look at those as we look at these issues.
To our attendees, we have a lot of questions in the chat, and I don't think we'll be able to feasibly get to them all. To our panelists, if you can look at the questions that are submitted and maybe type an answer to the attendee, just to work on some of those questions while we're maybe answering another one, that would be great. Back to Chi, thank you.
So we're going to get to another question that's been submitted by the audience today. The question is, officers have reported fearing retribution and retaliation for reporting a fellow officer and believe the wrongdoing officer will be protected more so than the good faith reporter. Is there currently a duty to report or any type of mandatory reporter requirement? If not, do you believe such a system should be created or would be effective? Do you have any suggestions to how to encourage positive change in the police culture?
I agree with Dean Haynes as he quickly shook his head from left to right. that does not exist based on anything anything I'm aware of, and you know, the few instances, and I really suggest people go watch Dave Chappelle's news. It's not even a stand-up; it's a special. It's a social commentary, really. The one time officer that I'm aware of tried to do this, Christian Dorner, he was fired from the police department, and we all know how that ended up. But there's not a duty for officers to say anything, which is crazy to me because they expect, they have this slogan: if you see something, say something to them. But if they see something, they say nothing. And it's all about protecting that thin blue line and that cop culture, right? That's why I'm so. I'll keep beating that drum. Like, I think it's more than training. It's how do we radically shift the culture of policing so we can shake out the bad apples, so we can shake out the people that don't really need to be on the job, so we can make room for the good men and women that do actually want to protect and serve at the best of their abilities.
In my direct experience, I came into military service, so we were learning in the aftermath of lessons from Vietnam, My Lai massacre, and they learned they had to improve the quality of the input in the officer corps from Cali and My Lai. But the other thing that was drilled into us, you have an obligation to not follow an illegal order. My particular undergrad, an honor code, which I'm sorry, when I graduated in 1981, still wasn't as internalized as it became when I was 30. So it is an ongoing and continual process. I'm in a profession now, my boss, Joe Gonzalez, had to break me up before he ran, had to break me up from another lawyer because he accused me of lying on the record. And my reputation is the only currency I have in this. My point being, you have to mandate and demand it. You have to ruthlessly punish when you find it. Beyond the video we saw from Minnesota, look at the initial reports. Go back to the report of the gentleman that was shot in the back running away in South Carolina about 4 years ago. The report said he was engaged in conflict and combat with the officer. That was the basis. Mm-hmm. And this is where maybe I'm parsing hairs. There is no training for ethics and telling the truth. None whatsoever. You insist on it, you demand it, and where you find a breach, you ruthlessly punish it. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know if that's a quantum change, but that's how you get there. Mm-hmm. Lo and behold, any misdemeanor prosecutor that I found out lied to me. Lo and behold, if either of us in the profession you're going to get sworn to aren't upright and forthcoming with the court. Mm-hmm. Period.
Yeah. I understand what Daryl's saying there, but I go back to what happened with Yokomek. I mean, Yokomek obviously knew what he did. He threw a 2-pound radio at someone's head and killed him, and lied about it to me, lied about it in the grand jury, but that culture, I think, allows that. And even if you look at those people in Buffalo, mm-hmm. the 2 cops in Buffalo who push a 75-year-old man down, yes. And then they say, well, he tripped and fell. And yes. then 75, all these people say, you know what, we quit this unit. And that's inherent in that culture. It's like, wow. And so you're dealing with that across the board at a lot of police departments, not just Buffalo.
and I will hear you, but I think, and what would happen if the city fathers, fine, thank you, noted. Who else wants this position and training and job? They aren't coming back anymore because they're endorsing it. I mean, I'm not trying to be obstructionist, but this, God, and maybe I'm gonna get drummed out of the office. Look, let me say it this way. I am a Texas prosecutor and damn proud of being a Texas prosecutor. I hope I do it right. But I can't lie. I have to wear the white hat. I have to provide the discovery. You can't do this any other way. And you have to zealously enforce. It's the law. You just can't accept any other way. Now, I don't know how you break it down. I don't know how you blow up the blue wall of silence. But once you see it, punish it.
Right. And I can say too, as a prosecutor, there was no in tandem with the police departments in New York.
Yes.
In New York, and I think sometimes people make that mistake that somehow that prosecution offices and police offices are like march in tandem with each other, and that's not necessarily the case.
Chris, do you still have any ties? I'm curious. Do you think you would see the same thing nowadays from what you saw?
I think I think things still happen. I think it's gotten in some ways better. I was surprised, for example, to find out in the last couple of days that this street unit had reemerged or reconstituted itself. There's this unit in New York City that goes around looking for crime. It's like this elite unit of cops. There's a lot of them. I think there's like 600. And they were responsible for shooting Ahmaud Arbery 41 times, if you recall that, back in the 90s, late 90s. I was in the office there, and some of the other prosecutors I wonder what he did. I don't understand. What did Ahmaud do? I mean, something else had to happen. Well, the man was taking out his wallet to show his ID, and he was shot 41 times because one cop was coming along and tripped and fell, and his gun went off, and then they all freaked out and they all fired at him. And no grand jury indictment. Would there be I think the difference probably today is there might be a grand jury indictment, but I don't know whether I would go to the grand jury. I don't know necessarily whether it would make it through. So I don't know. I can't say that it would be.
And I don't want to detract if there's a question. The more recently, the parallel that I've seen here, the day that Amber Geyer was indicted for murder, I said to myself, all right, the okie doke, the fix is in. Because I didn't see in any way how you could prove an intentional killing under those facts as I understood it. I thought it was more appropriately a manslaughter. Mm-hmm. And if I ever meet the colleague that asked her the question on cross, because the defense set up that training taught you to aim center of mass, you're taught to shoot to kill, and my colleague phrased it when he had her on cross, when you drew on him, center of mass, and shot him, you intended to kill him, just the way your training told you, didn't you? And the only answer you could give was a yes. The point being was that finally the focus had shifted from the implicit character of the deceased and on to the charged defendant. And so to me, that speaks volumes that when we have these integrity questions or blue wall questions, we have to change the focus onto the character of the accused for lying, instead of this cohesion. There can't be, because we're dealing with trust of the community, so integrity is crucial.
Thank you. And we also have some questions that are directed at you, Ms. Thomas.
Okay. I know that Sharon had her hand raised. If there was something that you wanted to tie that up with, or did you want to move on to the next question?
Yeah, I don't know which panelist said this, but that ethics or integrity, you can't train to it. I would like to kind of push back on that and say you can train towards ethical behavior. And that we've seen it done in the corporate world, where not that the corporate world is perfect, but there's been this huge move towards having ethics officers in place and ethics officers who will assess certain scenarios to determine whether or not there's been a breach in integrity. But it has to start at the foundational level so that the recruits that are coming in understand that ethics and integrity are crucial to them maintaining their position as a peace officer. And when ethical standards are violated, there's a heavy cost to pay. So, and I agree with you, Mr. Harris, about from a military standpoint. When I spent 15 years with the Air Force, and we had from a civilian employee perspective, we had regulations that dealt with progressive discipline. And if an employee was found to have lied about particular incidents in order to protect themselves, or lied in order to cover for someone else, there was swift action that was taken. And when the swift action is taken, it sends a message. Will we be able to turn all of this around like immediately? I don't think so. But I do think that we should have the audacity to insist to bring about these reforms.
Thank you, Ms. Thomas. And the Texas Commission on Law Enforcement has a mission to establish and enforce standards to ensure the people of Texas are served by highly ethical and trained law enforcement. How does the commission carry out this goal, and what, if anything, is it doing to combat systematic racism in our own police departments? I'm going to combine that with another question from the audience, who is asking, what forms do you specifically suggest we implement in order to change the culture of our police force?
Those are excellent questions. So in the training module, the peace officers are trained on areas of ethics and integrity. And police officers are trained with regard to issues that arise dealing with multiculturalism and diverse communities. That training does take place. Now, the question becomes, please understand that each agency, each local agency acts more or less independent, so to speak. We train, but the agencies themselves, they have the policies that they put in place. Those policies do not have to be reviewed by TCOL, Texas Commission on Law Enforcement. They have the disciplinary measures that they put in place. And a lot of times the disciplinary measures come through the collective bargaining agreement. They do not have to be reviewed by the Texas Commission on Law Enforcement. And you ask yourself why, and it is because of section 1701.47 of the Texas Occupation Code that does not give that authority to TCOL. And so what I would suggest is that because we already have this infrastructure in place, we should use it. And we should give the commission the authority to not only to train, but to oversee the outcomes of the training by the types of disciplinary measures that are taken and the type of disciplinary measures that come up for review. It's one thing to train. It's another thing to know, is this training working? And the only way we can know this is if local authorities are in agreement with us and will send us that information. And right now, under Texas law, they don't have to.
Can I add to that really quick?
Sure.
I think the biggest thing for me is because in Austin we fought our police union and we won. It's the first time it's happened anywhere in this country to fight some of the things that I believe Dean Haynes was talking about earlier, or Mr. Harris. I think, one, we have to get over this this idea that police unions are really unions, all right? Like, they are not, like, they're not unions in the sense of what most people would give thumbs up to a union for. Like, nobody's against them fighting for better pay and wages and things like that. But the idea that the police union in Austin had the power and privilege to negotiate the powers that be for the Office of Police Oversight didn't make any sense to me, right? Like, how can, right. So I think that's something that needs to be broken up on the state level. Also, you know, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not in legal at all, but also we have to start talking about truly independent oversight. And to me, outside of just funding and having, you know, subpoena powers, if that's the thing in some municipalities, it's also, to me, a conflict of interest that, and this happens in Austin, which is something that is beyond me. The same city legal that is representing APD is the same city legal that the Office of Police Oversight has to use if she's trying to, you know, do her job with the police. That can't actually work in real life, right? Like, she needs, or the Office of Police Oversight in Austin and anywhere where they have oversight entities need their own independent legal team outside of whatever legal team is there for the police department as well. So I think it's little things like that people are not thinking about. But, you know, when you think about that, that makes so much sense. And I think, you know, that's a little bit of reform that I hope people consider moving forward.
Yeah, I actually think it would be a major reform. There are a lot of civilian review boards that exist across the country, but a lot of them don't have teeth. And giving them additional power, or even having an independent state agency or part of this Attorney General's office that would look specifically at misconduct by police officers seems to make sense. But there has to be some other entity than the way that it's currently in place.
Looking at one of the questions that came in at 1752, almost seems the reason we have so many bad cops because there's almost no redeeming quality about being a cop. People hate you, you get poorly paid, can lose your life any day. No reason anyone would want to become unless they wanted the power or they weren't cut out for any other profession. I don't know that I agree with the premise. I mean, look, number one, policing and local government is local. If you are in if the income the city fathers where you are dictates certain wages for certain professions, okay, you're in keeping with everyone else. The SAPD contracts is fairly good.
Yep.
I know a cop makes more than a newly hired prosecutor his first year without the law school debt and can still work part-time. Yeah, I'm chasing you away, aren't I, Miss Okoro? We, you know, yes, we back the blue. Yes, it is dangerous. I'm not, I just, in the last few weeks, I've just turned around. I've reapplied for my job twice in the last 6 years based on election. Thrice over the previous 18 because Reed, bless you, because Reed didn't require it when you came in. One of the things I recall, Michael Morton in his 60-minute interviews after they talked to him about his ordeal and what he went through. And he kind of smiled, he says, accountability works. A district court judge lost his license and literally went into jail because of something he did 26 years prior. Accountability works if you have the will to enforce it.
All right, thank you, Mr. Harris. So it looks like we're running short of time, but I think, you know, our audience here is largely law students, members of the St. Mary legal and non-legal community. We came to this talk because we want to know what we can do to help. both in our capacity as law students or as already practicing attorneys. So this is open to everyone, but especially to you, Chas, in terms of, you know, community engagement. What is it that we in our capacity as law students can be doing to better our community for Black Americans?
And you know, I think Dean Haynes and Mr. Harris and Ms. Thomas can correct me if I'm wrong with this, but I think a lot of times we look at the people on the front lines, right? We look at the MLKs and the Malcolms and, you know, the Davises, but we didn't realize that they had legal teams that was helping, you know, people in the movement. You know, MLK had people that was helping them with legislation, right? When it comes to the Freedom Riders, we had legal teams that help get people out of jail, whether it was, you know, wrongly or rightfully so. They still have people in the legal field that could help them. Even a lot of people don't know this too. The Black Panthers had a legal team to help them set up the free lunch program, right? So like we have to look at being able to use our talents and our expertise and use them the best way we know how, right? Like if you're in law school, clearly you're not gonna be in the front lines, and that's okay. We don't need everybody on the front lines, right? We don't need everybody in jail, but we do need people with the expertise and the knowledge to be able to go and fight and litigate some of these cases, some of these really BS cases, and even help, you know, people like me. I remember when we started my organization, we didn't know anything about a 501c3, and it was really hard for us to go through all that. So I think, you know, just being able to offer your services, and I know people hate pro bono, but, you know, for discounted or pro bono or, you know, whatever, I think it's so many ways to help. It's just about seeing what's important to you. Like for me, it's criminal justice reform, right? So we always, so like, right, I'll give you a prime example of something that we're trying to set up. Daniel Serrett has a organization in New York called Common Justice, and it is an alternative for people to go around the legal system, right? And right now we have, like, this is a real life case, and I won't use the names, but a white man had a employee of color who was a woman who embezzled $3,800. He sent this months ago to, you know, like cops got involved. It was going through the court process. The cop called him on Friday and said, hey, you know, this is going to the grand jury. Just wanted to see if you still want to go through with this. So he called us, and because now he's at this awakening to where he realizes that maybe the legal system is not the best way to go about this, because this is going to be a collateral consequence for this young lady for the rest of her life. So we called in Sharon Patton and Kim Patton, who does restorative justice. We were able to get that case out of the legal system, and now they're going to sit down, you know, her new employer who heard about this, him being the victim, I guess, and her being the accused, and they're going to come up with a community contract to you know, do the healing and rehabilitation, so that way nobody has to go through the legal system. But stuff like that, you know, is how I think legal students can get involved, and people in the legal profession, period.
If I could, to the audience of primarily law students, look up or Google Charles Hamilton Houston. He's has a quote referred that says, a lawyer is either a social engineer or he is a parasite on society. More directly, St. Mary's, for when I used to coach mock trial, I got tired of begging for volunteers at Boston. Everybody wanted to do contracts or entertainment law. I don't beg nobody. And that's now in my past. Find a way to get involved. And I wish to expand the question a bit beyond the African-American community. We're in a predominantly Hispanic community. And what I see come in every day, reach out with Balsa, Sabla, Mabla. Find out where you can put that license to some help somewhere around anything else. In my particular regimen, because I also acknowledge what Dean Haynes pointed out, the vast variety of crime is committed within your own community, okay? So while I left the jar with my brothers and sisters on the other side of the bar, and I followed my younger brother into the law. When somebody breaks into your house or hurts one that you love, do you want the state to do something about it? That's why I'm on the state side. And you need to be prepared to make sure I do my job and don't disadvantage your client. where I can volunteer to those goodwill efforts of Mr. Moore, I will. But being a government lawyer, I'm, somewhat constrained. But everybody in the audience needs to think about this. I don't know where you are in relation to graduation. What kind of practice do you want to build for yourself? Does this touch something to remind you you're still part of the community? And follow that wherever it is, please.
So I would answer that question by putting this challenge out, is that, as a nation, we have found ourselves here before. We could all say, yes, we have. And the well-intentioned person would say, oh, I just want to help the Black community, or I want to help the Hispanic community. And I want to put this question, this challenge out, is that the Black community and the Hispanic community is your community. That if, injustice anywhere, how does it go? Injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. And we need to begin to move the boundaries and find where we fit, whether it is in a community that looks a lot like us or in a community that doesn't look a lot like us. And that there are two positions, especially as lawyers. I so strongly urge anyone that wants to become a lawyer to do what they need to do that, because the door is open to so many opportunities. And I have found that there are two major positions. There's a position of power and there's a position of influence. And oftentimes we will not allow ourselves to work in the systems where we could be most influential, because we want to work in systems where we are powerful. But if we're really smart and strategic about it, we will understand that nothing wrong with being in positions of power, and nothing wrong with being in organizations that look like us and that are representative of us as people of color. But if we're really going to do a work that is going to be long-term, and we're not repeating our efforts every 20 years, we got to look at occupying in positions of influence, where we have a voice to influence change, even when it looks like we're working for the other side. I hope those who have an ear to hear can hear what I'm saying there.
So it looks like we've come to the end of our time today, and I just want to first thank everybody who helped make this possible today, and thank our panelists. I'd like to thank Kat Gomez. I'd like to thank Bibi Gonzalez, Dean Haynes, Dean Hampley, Dean Roberts, Tanya, Jeff, Schomburg. Thank you so much for helping with the logistics and the planning of this panel, for making it possible. I'd like to thank each and every one of our panelists for your insight today and for agreeing to participate and help us begin this conversation, because this is nowhere near the end. But thank you for helping us open this conversation, and this is going to definitely be the first of many discussions like this. If anybody has any last words that they'd like to wrap up with in 1 minute or less, just to tie up any loose ends, I'd like to do that now. Yes, no, anybody?
I just want to say, recognize as lawyers and law students, we have an incredible power to change lives one at a time. That's a fantastic responsibility. There are so many things that lawyers can do to make the world a better place. And it's our hope that as you go through and as you practice law and you think about law, whatever it is that you're doing, that you do it with that mind, that you're trying to make the world a better place.
Thank you all. Yes, I think that we have all at least learned one new thing. during this conversation. And I hope we all take steps to make tangible change for our community in the capacity that we're able. Thanks to everybody for participating. Thanks especially to you, panelists, for taking time out of your very busy schedules to be with us and to help learn with us and educate us. It was really a pleasure to be able to host you, and thanks again.
Thank you to all of our attendees for RSVPing, and we hope to see you at the next one. We're going to go ahead and end this meeting here. Thank you, everyone who participated in any capacity, and have a blessed night. Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks
Bye.
for having me.
Bye.